Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick, and I've got a special treat for all of you, because the topic that was suggested, enters the battlefield replacement effects, has got me really excited. You see, it's no secret that this is known to be one of the hardest areas in Magic rules overall, and I was really excited to get a chance to talk about this one in a long-form presentation. So, we're going to go through everything that you're going to need to know to answer questions of this type, along with plenty of examples and background so that you'll be able to make these sorts of rulings confidently. Ready? Let's get started. Okay, so before we get too carried away, I am going to be assuming everyone watching has at least some background with what replacement effects are and how they work overall. And if you need a little bit of a refresher, I've got a video pinned in the description that should help you out. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to be assuming that everyone basically understands how this stuff works normally, and I'll be using that as a starting point to talk about how these replacement effects work and what makes them so special. And so, in order to consider that question, I want everybody to take a little bit of time and think about the answer to this rules scenario. Amy plays a coastal tower. Does coastal tower enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Now, go ahead and pause the video here if you need some more time to think, but I've just got a feeling that pretty much everybody watching has already got an idea in their head about what they think the correct answer for this question should be. And of course, the answer is that Coastal Tower does come into play tapped. But it turns out that there's actually a lot of heavy-duty rules stuff going on behind the scenes in order to make that answer be what we all know that it's supposed to be. And so, in order to understand exactly what I'm talking about, let's consider a couple of facts about how replacement effects work generally. So first of all, we know that replacement effects have to exist before the appropriate event that they're replacing occurs, and they can't go back in time to change something that's already happened. So what this would mean in this context is that the event that we're trying to modify is Coastal Tower entering the battlefield. So therefore, the replacement effect is going to need to exist before the time when Coastal Tower does enter the battlefield. Now, that is a little bit concerning when we come into this rule here, which says the abilities of all other objects, such as lands, usually function only while that object is on the battlefield. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, as you can see. None of them apply here. You can either take my word for that, or you can go in this section of the comprehensive rules and check it out for yourself. But that is the correct and not misleading statement, which is that none of the exceptions for this rule are going to be applicable to the case that we're talking about. So with that being the case, though, it is kind of an unusual situation, right? Because the replacement effect that makes the Coastal Tower come into play tapped needs to exist before the Coastal Tower enters the battlefield. But it doesn't exist, or it's not going to function until after the Coastal Tower has entered the battlefield. So when you take both of these into consideration, it's a little bit puzzling how abilities that say this enters the battlefield tapped, or any of a number of other types of replacement effects that have to deal with entering the battlefield, it's kind of not really evident how those types of replacement effects would work given the comprehensive rules and given especially these two specific ones. So how do we rectify this situation? And the answer is that enters the battlefield replacement effects specifically follow special rules. Well, they follow one specific special rule, and this is it. So, I understand that this is a lot of text. Unfortunately, this is one of those situations where there's a lot of text, and it's extremely dense, and all of it actually matters. So every word on this slide here could actually make a difference in a ruling. And it turns out that a lot of the cases where that happens, it turns out to actually be very subtle, and the reasoning that you need in order to understand exactly why and how it works that way is not trivial at all. So again, we're going to be going through this entire thing sentence by sentence, and we're going to be talking about exactly how all of these different clauses apply, and we're also going to have several examples that you can draw from to help you understand what sort of situations you should be looking for. So we'll start at the very beginning. Some replacement effects modify how a permanent enters the battlefield. So I've got a selection of situations here that fit under that category. Creatures your opponents play come into play tapped. Have clone enter the battlefield as a copy of something. Endless one gets some +1/+1 counters. There's of course others, but these three types of things, the counters and the coming to play tapped and the being a copy, those tend to be the types of replacement effects that work this way the most often. So, of course, they have this rule here, this sentence here is the next part of it. So such effects may come from the permanent itself if they affect only that permanent, as opposed to a general subset of permanents that includes it. And so we've got this same sort of thing here with the Azorius Guildgate. Azorius Guildgate enters the battlefield tapped. That's it. Azorius Guildgate entering the battlefield is the only event that this replacement effect looks for. Right? So that means it would fall under this sentence here. It does affect only that permanent. And so that means that Azorius Guildgate is a replacement effect that is allowed to come from the permanent itself. So this replacement effect is able to apply to the event of the permanent that it's on entering the battlefield. Now, if we contrast that with what it says on Gondgate here, it says gates that you control enter the battlefield tab. So this is just a general subset of permanents that happens to include the Gondgate. And so what that means is that this type of replacement effect is not going to fall under this sentence. And so that means that replacement effects of this sort, like Gondgate, are not able to apply to the permanent they're on, Gondgate in this case, entering the battlefield. Because it does not apply to only Gondgate. It applies to a general subset of permanents that includes Gondgate. And notice that this is based on what the wording of the replacement effect looks for. It is not based on the game state. So in other words, if you do not control any other gates at all, and you play a Gondgate, and the Gondgate would be coming into play tapped for some other independent reason, well, this replacement effect is still not able to affect the Gondgate entering the battlefield because it is not worded the correct way. So it is an effect that comes from the permanent itself, and it does not affect only that permanent. Even if there doesn't happen to be any other objects that are entering the battlefield that this replacement effect would be able to apply to with that specific event, the fact is that the wording of this event is what precludes it. The wording of this replacement effect is what precludes it from applying to that sort of event. And so that is how those would work. So that's the significance of this clause here, and that's what the difference you would want to look out for would look like. So, okay, they can also come from other sources, right? So obviously we know that replacement effects that change how stuff enters the battlefield, it could come from the permanent itself, but it could also come from other stuff. So here's a kind of a sampling of other stuff that you might have, and all of these are examples of an ability that changes how something enters the battlefield, but it comes from some other permanent or other source in general that is not the object itself that's entering, right? So those are some examples of some templates that would be examples of this sentence here. So this is where we get to the real meat of things. In order to determine which replacement effects apply and how they apply, the way you do that is you check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield. So this is where we can get back to our coastal tower example that we were talking about at the very beginning, right? So what's going to happen is the coastal tower is entering the battlefield, and then the game has to check to see if there's any replacement effects that want to modify the event of coastal tower entering the battlefield. Right, so when it does that, to determine which replacement effects apply and how they apply, we're going to check the characteristics of the permanent that's entering as it would exist on the battlefield. And so what that means is we get to check the characteristics of Coastal Tower and see if Coastal Tower has any abilities that might affect the move. And hey, what do you know? There is an ability that says Coastal Tower comes into play tap. And so because of that, that means the game knows that this replacement effect is something that it's going to take into account. Recall that we already talked about the other test that it has to pass, where it only applies to the event of Coastal Tower entering the battlefield, not a subset of permanents that happens to include it, which of course it does. It has the exact same form as what we saw on the Guildgate previously. So yeah, it passes that test too, and so the game knows that it is possible to apply this one. And we can see that when it would be on the battlefield, the Coastal Tower would have that ability. And so therefore the game does see this as one of the replacement effects that would apply. And so that is the reason, significantly more complicated than probably most people who hadn't thought about this before would have guessed. That is the reason why Coastal Tower does indeed enter the battlefield tapped, and this ability does indeed work the way it obviously is supposed to. Even though there was a couple of obstacles that maybe made it seem like that might not be what would happen. So, okay, now when we check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield, we might have some stuff that's going on. So, for example, we've got this Diregraph Ghoul, okay? And so the Diregraph Ghoul enters the battlefield tapped, just like the Coastal Tower did. But let's say we're reanimating the Diregraph Ghoul from our graveyard, and there's a Yixla Jailer in play. So the Yixla Jailer says that creatures in graveyards lose all abilities. All cards in graveyards lose all abilities. So it would not have this ability at all at the time when it's entering the battlefield. In other words, when the game is deciding which replacement effects apply to the event of Diregraph Ghoul entering the battlefield, remember that replacement effects apply immediately before the event that they replace. So at the time when the game is deciding what replacement effects apply, the Diregraph Ghoul is indeed in your graveyard. And so that means the Yixla Jailer is still applying to it, and it's stripping away all the abilities that the Diregraph Ghoul has, because it is at this point in time, it is in the graveyard. So, however, remember what we're doing. To determine which replacement effects apply and how they apply, we check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield. And so what that means is the Diregraph Ghoul on the battlefield is not going to have this Yixla Jailer applying to it. It's just going to be a normal Diregraph Ghoul with this ability. And so that means that with Yixla Jailer out, if you were to reanimate the Diregraph Ghoul, it would still enter the battlefield tapped. And it's because of this one here, because as it would exist on the battlefield, it would have this ability that says Diregraph Ghoul enters the battlefield tapped. And so therefore, even though the Diregraph Ghoul does not have that ability at the point in time when the game is deciding whether it should enter the battlefield tapped or untapped, the game can still see that when it's on the battlefield, it will have this ability, and so therefore that ability does apply. Okay, pretty cool, right? Now, when we're checking the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield, there's all kinds of ways that those characteristics can change. This is an example of one of those, for instance. So when we are checking the characteristics of the permanent as it would apply on the battlefield, we take into account replacement effects that have already modified how it enters the battlefield. Okay, so with this example, we've got a clone, and we're going to clone a Diregraph Ghoul. So will the clone enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Right? So the answer to that question is right here. This is a replacement effect, and the clone replacement effect that changes it into a copy of Diregraph Ghoul has already modified how the clone enters the battlefield. And so therefore, when the game is deciding what replacement effects apply and how they apply to the clone that's entering the battlefield, it will take into account that the clone, while it's on the battlefield, has already got this replacement effect applying to that's going to make it a copy of the Diregraph Ghoul. And so that means the clone that's entering the battlefield will have this ability that says it enters the battlefield tapped. And so that means that the clone will enter the battlefield tapped if you copy a Diregraph Ghoul. And, you know, again, I wanted to reflect a little bit on how well this is working out, right? I feel like if you asked a bunch of Magic players what they thought the right answer to this question should be, most of them would correctly identify that the clone enters the battlefield tapped. And that's without having any of the heavy-duty, in-depth rules stuff that we were just talking about. That'd just be based on intuition alone. And so what that means is the rules are basically working the way they're supposed to. Now, I'm not going to say that that's 100% of the cases with this, but I do think that this situation is pretty representative, and I think a lot of the cases actually do end up working pretty well. So, okay, we take into account replacement effects that have already modified how the permanent enters the battlefield. What else would we take into account? Well, we also take into account continuous effects from the permanent's own static abilities that would apply to it when it's on the battlefield. So I know that's kind of a mouthful. So this here is like kind of the canonical example for this sort of thing happening. I believe these cards were both in standard together at the same time. And so this was actually a question that came up. So what is a static ability? A static ability would be something like this. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa is not a creature. Right? So notice how this isn't like an activated ability or a triggered ability. It's just a sentence that's true all the time. As long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. So, this sentence here is just constantly checking the game state to see what your devotion is. And anytime your devotion gets too low, it'll stop being a creature. Anytime your devotion gets back up, it'll become a creature again. So this would qualify as a static ability. And notice that this static ability, of course, would apply to the Thassa while Thassa is on the battlefield. Of course, Thassa isn't a creature, so yeah, it definitely does apply to the Thassa while the Thassa is on the battlefield. So that means that this continuous effect from the permanent's own static ability would apply to it once it's on the battlefield. And so what that means is that because of that, the game is going to consider this ability when the game is trying to decide what Thassa looks like on the battlefield. So you play the Thassa, and the game has to decide whether it is a creature your opponent controls or not. So this ability affects whether it's a creature. So the game has to decide, in order to determine what replacement effects apply and how they apply, the game has to decide what the Thassa will look like while it's on the battlefield. And when it's doing that, it takes into account this ability here because it's a continuous effect from the permanent's own static ability. And so that means that the answer of whether Thassa enters the battlefield tapped or untapped is actually variable. It depends on how much your devotion to blue is at the time when the Thassa is entering the battlefield, right? So if your devotion is lower, lower than 5, then the Thassa will not be a creature, and so it'll enter the battlefield untapped. If your devotion is above 5, then the Thassa will be a creature, and so therefore it would come into play tapped. Now the really interesting point, or the really interesting question here, is where the break point is, right? Because there's got to be like some number, and if your devotion starts out at that number, then it will not be a creature. But if you have this number or more, then the Thassa will be a creature. And so it actually turns out that this is kind of a really interesting scenario, because remember that while this is going on, the Thassa is not in play, right? So the Thassa does not count as being on the battlefield when the game is trying to determine what it's going to look like. Now, the game can use its imagination and think, okay, like if the Thassa was on the battlefield, what would it look like? And usually it does a pretty good job of seeing exactly what the Thassa would look like. But the Thassa is still on the stack, or whatever zone it's entering the battlefield from at the time when this is going on. It hasn't entered the battlefield yet, right? So what that means is that when the game is counting up what your devotion to blue is, when it is deciding what replacement effects apply and how they apply to the event of Thassa entering the battlefield, the Thassa is not going to be considered in play yet. And so therefore the blue mana that you would be getting from the Thassa's own mana cost is not going to factor into the devotion count. So the way that it will actually work is if you have 4 blue devotion on the battlefield lined up ready to go, and Thassa itself would be the 5th one, then when the game is trying to decide what replacement effects apply and how they apply, the Thassa is not on the battlefield yet, so you're not going to count the blue from the Thassa itself. So the game is going to see, okay, well, Thassa has this ability that says, as long as your devotion to blue is less than 5, Thassa isn't a creature. And your devotion is only 4 right now, so that means that Thassa is not going to be a creature when it's on the battlefield. And then the game will have the Thassa enter the battlefield untapped. And immediately, once it's on the battlefield, it's going to bump your devotion up to 5. So it will enter the battlefield as a creature. Anything that says when a creature enters the battlefield, do this, or if a creature would enter the battlefield, that sort of stuff is still going to interact with that event as though Thassa is a creature, because as far as the game can see, a creature is entering the battlefield. But the fact is that a creature, if you have a triggered ability, the triggered ability is going to trigger because Thassa, a creature, has entered the battlefield. But the game cannot see that Thassa will be a creature when it's on the battlefield in time to apply the imposing sovereign's ability, because that applies immediately before the Thassa enters the battlefield. And even though the game can look ahead to see what the Thassa is going to look like and use its imagination, and even though it will take continuous effects from the Thassa's own static abilities into account when it's doing that, the Thassa's mana itself is not going to be increasing your devotion until the Thassa is actually on the battlefield. So that's the reason why that would work. The Thassa will enter the battlefield tapped if you have 5 devotion lined up ready to go before the Thassa enters the battlefield. But if you only have 4, then or any lesser amount, of course, then the Thassa will enter the battlefield untapped because the game won't consider it to be a creature. Even though in the specific case of if you had 4, the Thassa will enter the battlefield and be a creature as soon as it's on the battlefield. So that was a really trippy and counterintuitive ruling, and a lot of people were like super crazy about that one back when these 2 cards were in standard. I feel like the like popularity of that ruling has kind of fallen off, but it's still, I think, in the judge vault for posterity's sake. So yeah, that's the way that one would work. So okay, and there's one more thing, right? So we remember to determine which replacement effects apply and how they apply, we check the characteristics of the permanent as it would exist on the battlefield. And there's some ways that we could change those characteristics because we take into account replacement effects that have already modified how it enters, and continuous effect from the permanent's own static abilities, and one more, which is continuous effects that already exist on the battlefield and would apply to that permanent. So this clause is the reason why if you have a Blood Moon out and then you play a Hallowed Fountain, you don't have to pay 2 life. It just enters the battlefield untapped. And the reason is because when the game is deciding what replacement effects apply and how they apply, the game is going to notice that this Hallowed Fountain has a replacement effect on it. But it's also going to know that while it's on the battlefield, there's going to be this Blood Moon, continuous effect from the Blood Moon, and that is going to apply to the Hallowed Fountain. And when this effect applies to the Hallowed Fountain will lose all of its abilities, so it won't have this ability. And so that means that with the Blood Moon out, the Hallowed Fountain will always enter the battlefield untapped, and you don't even get the chance to pay 2 life. The same thing would be true for this Dark Depths here. Again, the Blood Moon already exists, and it would apply to the Dark Depths, and so that means that the effect that makes it enter with 10 ice counters on it is not going to exist, and so it will enter the battlefield with 0 ice counters on it. It also won't have this ability here that lets you sacrifice it to make a 20/20, again because of the Blood Moon. But if the Blood Moon were to leave play, then the Dark Depths would still have 0 ice counters on it, but it would regain this ability, which would mean that you would get to sacrifice it. So that was a way, and I guess it still is a way, that people in mostly Legacy were able to get the Dark Depths token at a significant discount. So that was like kind of the other big thing. That specific line in the rule actually changed. There was a time in Magic history when it worked the opposite way. And so those 2 examples that I just talked about, which the way Blood Moon interacts with Dark Depths and the Shocklands, those are the 2 like most significant consequences of that change is the way that those work now. So okay, so that is it, right? So that is all of the rules. So now we're ready for some challenge questions. And don't worry, I know I kind of went through all that stuff, with only one example. So here are some challenge questions that I put together that'll kind of test your understanding of what you just went through here. So the first one would be like Amy has a Root Maze and a Mycosynth Lattice out, and she's going to be playing a Grizzly Bears, for example, right? So does the Grizzly Bears enter the battlefield tapped or untapped, right? And so we can see that the game is going to potentially have a replacement effect that modifies how the Grizzly Bears enters the battlefield. And so in order to determine what replacement effects apply and how they apply, we're going to check the characteristics of the Grizzly Bears as it would exist on the battlefield, taking into account continuous effects from other sources that already exist and would apply to the Grizzly Bears. So what that means in the context of this question is that when the game is trying to decide what the Grizzly Bears is going to look like on the battlefield, it's going to notice that Mycosynth Lattice is going to be applying to the Grizzly Bears while it's on the battlefield, and when that happens, it's going to be making the Grizzly Bears into an artifact. And so what that means is that the Root Maze is going to see that something that is an artifact is entering the battlefield. So it will apply to the Grizzly Bears entering the battlefield, and it will make the Grizzly Bears come into play tapped. Okay, so that's not that bad, right? I feel like that's, again, another one of those things that I feel like most people, if you put that question in front of them, would just guess the right answer, even if they didn't know like exactly how the rules machinery worked in order to make the answer be that. So, okay, that's good. Now this one here, I will say this one here is a lot more complicated. It took a lot more people by surprise. Again, you can see that these cards not only were in standard together, they were in the same set together. So this happened in like limited events maybe. I really hope there was a limited event somewhere where this happened. So the idea is, of course, we're going to play in Neoform, and when we search our library for a creature card, we're going to get this guy, the Mowu. So how many +1/+1 counters does Mowu enter the battlefield with? Right? And so I want to draw everybody's attention to the fact that this replacement effect that's on the creature, it actually does not apply normally to something entering the battlefield, right? It applies to counters being put on Mowu. And so it's kind of weird that this replacement effect would be seen in this presentation at all, where we're talking about enters the battlefield replacement effects. But we have to remember what the rule says. So the rule specifically says that any replacement effects that modify how a permanent enters the battlefield are subject to this rule here. So this is the criteria that the game looks at to decide what replacement effects apply and how they apply in any case where a permanent is entering the battlefield. So because the specific state of the game is Mowu is entering the battlefield, and we want to see if a replacement effect, if a certain specific replacement effect applies to that event, this is the criteria that we use. So guess what? Is this a replacement effect? It sure is. Is Mowu entering the battlefield? Yes. Does this replacement effect want to apply to the event of Mowu entering the battlefield? And the answer is yes, because Mowu is entering the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. And that does count as one or more +1/+1 counters being put on Mowu. And so what that means is that the game uses all the same normal criteria to decide whether this replacement effect applies as it would for any of the other stuff earlier on in the presentation. So yeah, such effects may come from the permanent itself if they affect only that permanent. And hey, guess what? If a counter would be put on Mowu Loyal Companion, and that's it, that's the only permanent that this affects. And so yes, that means that if the Mowu is getting neoformed into, then you are going to be getting an additional +1/+1 counter, and then this one is going to bump you up to 2 +1/+1 counters. So the game is going to see the event's going to start out as Mowu enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Then the game is going to check to see if any replacement effects are going to apply to that event, and it's going to see that yes, we have this replacement effect that does apply to that event because of what we just talked about, and so therefore you're going to get a second +1/+1 counter from the Mowu's ability. So that's really cool. Now, the really, really weird thing is this card was also in Standard at about the same time. Winding Constrictor. Now, if you notice, Winding Constrictor's ability is worded a little bit different. It says if they would be placed on an artifact or creature you control. Now, Winding Constrictor is an artifact or creature you control, but let's remember what we just talked about in that rule, as opposed to a general subset of permanents that includes it. So because the Winding Constrictor's replacement effect does not apply to only Winding Constrictor specifically entering the battlefield, it applies to a general subset of permanents that might just so happen to include Winding Constrictor. That means that it does not fall under the specific conditions set forth in the rule that governs whether this replacement effect can apply to the event of Winding Constrictor entering the battlefield. And so that means that this specific replacement effect, because it is not worded in such a way that it only applies to Winding Constrictor, is not going to be able to apply to the event of Winding Constrictor entering the battlefield. So even though it looks like basically the exact same thing, the answer is actually completely different. If you neoform into a Winding Constrictor, you will only get one +1/+1 counter on the Winding Constrictor. So yeah, that's pretty weird, right? A lot of people thought that situation, that ruling was very unusual. But yeah, that's how that works, and that's how that happens. So here's another one. This another like kind of standard one that I think like, you know, maybe you would expect to see on like a judge exam if you were studying for this sort of thing. So we got a Meddling Mage. We're going to reanimate the Meddling Mage, but there's the Ixalan Jailer in play. Does Meddling Mage's controller get to name a card? And so the answer to this goes right back to the diagraph ghoul. We talked about a very similar situation. And so remember, when we are deciding which replacement effects apply and how they apply, we do not take into account what the permanent looks like in the spot that it's at. Rather, we look at what the permanent would look like once it is on the battlefield. And once it's on the battlefield, Meddling Mage is not going to be in your graveyard, so it's not going to be losing all its abilities, so it will have this ability that lets you name a card, and therefore you will name a card with Meddling Mage if you reanimate it with a Yixla Jail Route. Now, there's this other card called Dress Down. Now, if we were to take a look at what the Meddling Mage would look like on the battlefield where a Dress Down was in play, then we would see that there is a continuous effect that already exists that would apply to the Meddling Mage. And so therefore, this Meddling Mage loses all abilities is going to be part of what the game looks at when the game is determining what replacement effects apply and how they apply. So when the game is trying to see if there's any replacement effects that might want to apply to the Meddling Mage entering the battlefield, it'll see, well, there's this Dress Down in play that's going to make the Meddling Mage lose all its abilities, so the Meddling Mage does not have this ability at all. So you will not get to name a card with Meddling Mage if you play it from your graveyard or, just normally, and there's a Dress Down out. So that's like kind of the difference there. So it is kind of like, especially if you know a little bit more about how replacement effects work, it's kind of counterintuitive, right? Because the point where you're deciding what replacement effects apply, the Meddling Mage isn't on the battlefield yet. So it feels like maybe you should get to name a card. Or with the previous example, the Meddling Mage is still in your graveyard, so maybe it feels like you shouldn't get to name a card. But as we just talked about, that's not exactly how the game views it. And so finally, there's another really great challenge question. This one is very challenging. I know a lot of, at least one really knowledgeable judge might have gotten this one wrong in a really high-profile way. So the question is, Amy plays an Urborg on her first turn and passes. Nick controls no other lands, and he plays an Isolated Chapel as his first land of the game. Does Isolated Chapel enter the battlefield tapped or untapped? Right? And so if we take a look at things, when the game is deciding which replacement effects apply and how they apply, the game is going to look at what the Isolated Chapel would look like while it's on the battlefield. And so, okay, there's going to be this replacement effect that says Isolated Chapel enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a plains or a swamp. So, do we control a plains or a swamp at this time? Well, when the game is deciding how this replacement effect applies, remember that it will be considering any continuous effects that already exist and would apply to the Isolated Chapel. So this continuous effect does already exist, and it would apply to the Isolated Chapel. So it's starting to look like, even though we don't have any other lands in play, we could play the Isolated Chapel untapped. However, if we remember what we were talking about with the Thassa and the Imposing Sovereign, we can remember a very important fact, which is that even though the game is using its imagination to decide what the Isolated Chapel will look like when it's on the battlefield, the game still does not have Isolated Chapel on the battlefield yet. It's still in your hand or like whatever zone you were playing it from. And so what that means is that in this case, Amy's Urborg is not applying, even though the game sees that Amy's Urborg is applying to the Isolated Chapel, the Isolated Chapel is not yet on the battlefield. So that means that when the game is trying to decide whether Amy controls a plains or a swamp, the game will say, no, you do not control a plains or a swamp. And it's for the exact same reason that the devotion to Thassa did not include the mana symbol in Thassa's own mana cost. It's because when we are deciding how this replacement effect applies, we look at how the permanent would exist on the battlefield, but we know that it's not yet on the battlefield. And so because the Isolated Chapel is not yet on the battlefield, that means that Amy does not control a swamp. She is about to control a swamp, but the game can see that at this specific time, she does not control an actual swamp. So it's kind of weird, and this is one of the reasons why I think this topic is like super confusing. It's very easy to get confused on this kind of subtle interaction, because it looks like it should, but it turns out that it actually shouldn't, but maybe for some purposes it actually does. So hopefully I've done a good enough job explaining that. If you want more detail on how this specific interaction works, I do have a full video where I talk about it in a little bit more detail and only touch on specifically this case. And so that's going to bring us up to my last one of the challenge questions. And so, because this is the last one, I had to make it like really memorable. So we've got Amy is going to play an Adaptive Automaton, right? And Nick is going to respond with a gather specimens. And Nick also controls a Bramblewood Paragon while this is happening. So the questions are, who chooses which creature type the adaptive automaton will get, and if that type ends up being warrior, will the adaptive automaton enter the battlefield with a additional +1/+1 counter on it, right? So the first thing that we're going to need to do for this situation is maybe review a little bit about how replacement effects work in general. So if there are 2 or more replacement effects that want to modify the way an object affects a player, we have to know how that will shape out. So let's identify all of the replacement effects that want to apply to this situation, like right out of the gate. And so the Bramblewood Paragon does not apply at all, right? Like the adaptive automaton isn't a warrior, and it's not entering the battlefield under Nick's control, right? So I don't even know why this is on screen right now. It's not actually going to apply at all to this event, as far as we know. Now, the Gather Specimens definitely will, because we do have a creature that's entering the battlefield under an opponent's control this turn. So this replacement effect is going to apply. And this one, because the adaptive automaton definitely is entering the battlefield, this one will apply as well. So we have 2 different replacement effects that both want to apply. And so if we look back at our reminder rules here, we can see that the affected player chooses one of the replacement effects to apply. And that's the person who controls the automaton that's entering the battlefield. But there's some specific rules that govern that. And in particular, if any of the replacement effects would modify under whose control an object would enter the battlefield, those must be chosen before we can proceed on to any applicable replacement effects apply, which is what the choosing a creature type would fall under. So what that means is that we're going to start out with Amy having adaptive automaton entering the battlefield under her control. And there's going to be 2 replacement effects that want to apply to it. There's this one, and then there's this one. And Amy gets to choose which one goes first, except she actually doesn't get to choose, because the rules say that this replacement effect, because it modifies what players control the permanent is entering under, has to be chosen first. So that means that we're going to modify the event to adaptive automaton enters the battlefield under Nick's control. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to see if there's any replacement effects that want to apply to this event. And Bramblewood Paragon still does not apply, right? Because, okay, now it is entering the battlefield under Nick's control, so that's good, but it's still not a warrior. It's a construct, completely different. But we do have this other replacement effect that we can apply. So it says, as it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Now, the choose a creature type is going to be done by the person who controls adaptive automaton, which at this point is Nick. And so Nick can choose the warrior creature type. And let's examine what might happen if he were to do that. Then the game would check to see if there was any more replacement effects after this replacement effect is applied. So the game is going to check to see if there's any more replacement effects that want to apply to adaptive automaton entering the battlefield. And when it's doing that, the game is going to see, well, let's take another look at this Bramblewood Paragon, because this hasn't applied to this event yet. While adaptive automaton is on the battlefield, will it be a warrior? And remember, when we are deciding which replacement effects apply and how they apply, we do take into account other replacement effects that have already affected how it enters the battlefield, and any continuous effects generated by that permanent's own static abilities that will apply to it when it's on the battlefield. And so what that means is that when the game is trying to decide whether Bramblewood Paragon's replacement effect applies or not, it will consider that the adaptive automaton has had a creature type, warrior, chosen for it, and it will be that creature type in addition to its other types. And so that means that, yes, you will get an additional +1/+1 counter on the adaptive automaton if you were to do that play, and that's the reason why. So I thought that was an extremely cool question, and it kind of like builds a ladder, and it incorporates a lot of the different stuff that we talked about from this episode. So I hope that this is all the questions that I've prepared for you. I hope that after seeing these examples, you've got a good foundation that you can use if you have any questions like this come up in a game that you're judging, and you'll feel confident in making these sorts of rulings for yourself. And there is one other thing that I wanted to say, which is thank you so much to all of my patrons and to anybody else who supports me on this channel. I'm so very grateful to all of you, and I really hope that this awesome topic has satisfied you and your thirst for curiosity for how this topic works. And definitely be sure to join in the votes for future daily rulings that I do these patron picks every month. So the next one and all the future ones you of course are eligible to vote for. Thank you again so much to all of my patrons, and of course indeed to anybody who supports this channel in other ways that don't involve directly donating money to me. So that is all that I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.